Ruth Calloway had $9 in the coffee tin on the shelf, and she was standing at the feed store counter trying to decide if she could spend one of them on chicks. It was late April, and the feed store had brought in a new batch that morning, and most of the farmers in the county had already come and gone with the good ones. What was left in the crate by the back door was a small, strange group nobody had wanted. They were not yellow like the other chicks. They were a pale, dull white with a faint yellow wash along the wings, almost the color of old cream left too long on the counter. The man at the store called them mongrels. He said nobody knew what they would grow into, and he was ready to give them away just to clear the crate before closing. Ruth looked at them for a long time. They were smaller than the other chicks, but their eyes were sharp, and they moved with a quickness the yellow chicks did not have. She thought of her father, who used to say that most people only wanted what other people already wanted, and that this was why so few people ever found anything good. She counted out $1 and took all 10 of the strange white-yellow chicks nobody wanted. Her neighbor, Frank Doyle, came by the fence the next Saturday, the way he had been coming by the fence since her husband passed 2 winters before. He looked into the brooder box she had set up near the stove and shook his head slowly. He said he had never seen chicks that color and that in his experience, birds that odd usually turned out to be more trouble than they were worth. Ruth told him she had paid $1 for them, and Frank laughed and said she had gotten exactly what she paid for. Ruth did not argue. She only said that she would let him know in a year how the birds turned out, and Frank said he would hold her to it. He came by twice a week after that, mostly to check the fence line, he said, though Ruth suspected the fence had very little to do with it. The chicks grew fast, faster than she expected. By the 6th week they were nearly the size birds usually reached at 10 weeks, and their feathers had come in a strange, soft white with a warm yellow shimmer underneath, like butter catching the morning light. They were calm birds, easy to handle, and they never seemed to fight over the feed the way other chickens did. Ruth wrote down what she noticed in a small notebook she kept on the kitchen table, the way her father had once kept notes on his cattle. She wrote about the growth rate, the feed they ate, and the way their combs came in early and full. She built a second brooder box out of old fence boards when the first one grew too crowded, working late into the evening by lamplight after the rest of her chores were done. Her hands were tired most nights, but she did not mind the work, because there was something steady in watching the birds grow a little bigger each week, something that felt like proof she had not wasted her dollar after all. She fed them the same feed she gave her old hens at first, then began mixing in a little extra grain once she noticed how quickly they cleared their dish. By the end of June, the birds no longer looked like chicks at all. They stood tall and calm in the yard, their feathers catching the light in a way that made visitors stop and ask what breed they were, and Ruth would only say she was still finding out. The first eggs came in August. Ruth was in the coop gathering feed dishes when she saw one sitting in the straw, larger than any egg she had gathered from her old hens. The shell was a pale cream color, smooth as glass, and heavier in her hand than she expected. She cracked it into a bowl that evening and found a yolk so deep in gold it looked almost orange, sitting high and round in a thick, clear white. She had never seen an egg like it. She scrambled it plain, without salt or butter, because she wanted to taste it for what it was, and she sat at her table afterward thinking about the dollar she had spent and the crate nobody else had wanted to touch. She brought a basket of 12 eggs to Constance Weller, who ran the general store and had bought eggs from half the county for 20 years. Constance held one up to the window light and turned it slowly. She cracked one into the bowl she kept behind the counter for exactly this purpose, and her eyebrows went up when she saw the yolk. She asked how many hens Ruth had, and Ruth said 10, though not all of them were laying yet. Constance offered 25 cents a dozen, nearly double the market rate that spring, and said she would take every egg Ruth could bring her from that point forward. Ruth walked out of the store with the empty basket and did the arithmetic in her head the whole drive home. 10 hens, even at half laying, would bring in more in a month than she usually made in a season from her old flock. Frank heard about the egg price from Constance before Ruth ever told him herself, which was how most things traveled in that county. He came to the fence on Thursday with a different look on his face than he usually wore, something closer to surprise than doubt. He asked if it was true about the 25 cents, and Ruth said it was. He was quiet for a moment, looking past her at the coop, and then he said that maybe he had been wrong about the birds. Ruth reminded him that she had told him to wait and see, and Frank admitted that he had not expected to see quite so soon. He offered to help her build a second coop that weekend, since the flock would need more room if the hens kept laying like that, and Ruth said she would be glad for the help, and glad for the company too, though she did not say the second part out loud. By the following spring, Ruth had grown her flock to nearly 40 birds through careful breeding, keeping back the pullets that showed the strongest coloring and the best growth. She wrote to the state agricultural office describing the birds, their coloring, their egg size, and their unusual calm temperament, and asked if anyone there could identify the breed. The reply came 6 weeks later from a poultry specialist who said the description matched an old dual-purpose breed that had nearly disappeared from American farms decades earlier, valued in its time for exactly the traits Ruth had described. He asked if she would be willing to sell breeding pairs to the university's research flock, and named a price that made Ruth sit down at her kitchen table and read the letter twice more before she believed it. She sold 6 breeding pairs to the university that summer and kept the rest of the flock growing at home. Word of the birds spread through 3 counties, carried mostly by Constance and by the farmers who bought hatching eggs from Ruth to start their own small flocks. Some of them drove an hour or more just to see the birds for themselves before they would agree to pay her price, and Ruth would walk them out to the coop and let them watch the hens move about the yard, calm and steady, before she said a single word about money. Most of them left with a dozen hatching eggs wrapped carefully in straw, and more than one came back a second time asking for more. By the end of that second summer, Ruth had more money in the bank than she had seen since before her husband died, and she began to think seriously about the Marsh place next door, 110 acres with a good well and a barn in far better shape than her own, sitting empty since Old Man Marsh had moved into town the year before. She walked the fence line between the 2 properties more than once that summer, looking at the creek that cut through the back corner of the marshland, thinking about how much easier the waterfowl she wanted to raise would be with a creek running through the property instead of the shallow pond she had been hauling water to all spring. Frank was at the fence the evening she finally decided to make an offer. He had been coming to the fence for 2 years by then, first out of concern, then out of curiosity, and finally, Ruth suspected, out of something neither of them had said plainly. She told him about the Marsh place, and he looked at her the way he had looked at the eggs that first August, surprised and recalculating something in his head. He asked how she planned to pay for 110 acres, and Ruth pulled her notebook from her apron pocket and showed him the numbers, the egg income, the breeding pair sales, the hatching egg orders already promised for the coming spring. Frank read the notebook slowly, the way he read everything, and when he finished he said the numbers were sound, and that Old Man Marsh would likely take the offer given how long the land had sat unsold. Ruth made the offer in the first week of April, almost exactly 2 years after she had stood at the feed store counter with $1 in her hand and a crate of strange white-yellow chicks nobody wanted in front of her. Old Man Marsh accepted within the week, glad to have the land off his hands, and Ruth signed the papers on a bright morning with the smell of spring dirt coming through the open window of the county office. In 2 years, she bought the farm next door, and the whole county knew exactly how she had done it, because Constance had told most of them already. Frank came to help her walk the new property that same weekend, the 2 of them stepping through fields that had gone quiet for a year, talking about where a second set of coops might go and whether the barn would hold the flock through winter. He told her, somewhere near the creek that ran along the back of the marshland, that he had been wrong about a good many things over the past 2 years, not just the chicks. Ruth asked what else he had been wrong about, and Frank said he had spent 2 years telling himself he was only checking the fence line, when the truth was he had been finding reasons to see her. Ruth did not say anything for a moment, only looked out at the new land, the creek, and the old barn that would soon hold her growing flock. She told him that if he wanted a reason to come around now, he no longer needed the fence for an excuse, and Frank said that was the first piece of good advice he had gotten from her that did not involve chickens. They walked back toward the house together as the light started to go gold over the fields, past the coop where the strange white-yellow birds were already settling in for the evening, calm and quiet the way they always were, worth, in the end, far more than the $1 she had paid for them, and far more than anyone in the county had believed that first spring morning at the feed store.